The aroma of freshly brewed coffee and the gentle hum of conversation filled the cozy cafe in downtown San Francisco. The place had a rustic charm, its wooden floors creaking slightly with every step, and the warm glow of Edison bulbs cast a golden hue over the patrons sipping their lattes and working on their laptops. It was the kind of place where people came to unwind, a safe haven from the rush of the outside world. Before we start, smash the like and subscribe buttons for more updates. Among the patrons that afternoon sat none other than Stephen Curry, the Golden State Warriors superstar. Dressed in a simple hoodie and jeans, he had slipped into the cafe unnoticed, hoping for a quiet moment to himself. His hands cradled a steaming cup of cappuccino as he scrolled through his phone, occasionally glancing out the window at the world passing by. He enjoyed these small, ordinary moments, times when he wasn't an NBA icon, but just another person enjoying a warm drink. But the tranquility of the cafe shattered when a man's voice suddenly rang out, loud and cutting. "Hey, you think you're some kind of hero?" Heads turned, startled by the abrupt outburst. Some people instinctively shrank back, unsure of what was happening, while others craned their necks to get a better look. The source of the voice was an older man, his face lined with years of experience but hardened by something deeper, perhaps anger, resentment, or disappointment. He was dressed in a faded Warriors jersey, but there was nothing celebratory about his stance. He was glaring straight at Steph. For a brief moment, confusion flashed across Steph's face. He wasn't sure if this was just an overly enthusiastic fan or something else entirely. He set his cup down and turned to face the man fully. "You think you care about this city? About this team?" The man's voice wavered with emotion. "You think showing up on TV, smiling for the cameras, makes you one of us?" The cafe was dead silent now. The baristas had stopped making drinks, customers had paused mid-sip, and even the sound of the coffee grinder had been reduced to a distant hum. Everyone was waiting to see how Steph would respond. He could have reacted in many ways. He could have told the man off, reminded him that he had given everything to the Warriors, to the Bay Area. He could have stood up and left, brushing off the encounter as just another disgruntled person with too many opinions, but Steph Curry was not like most people. Instead of meeting anger with anger, he leaned forward slightly, his expression softening. "I hear you," he said simply, his voice calm and steady. "What's on your mind?" The man seemed taken aback. He had expected a defensive reaction, a brush-off, maybe even security stepping in, but not this. He blinked, then scoffed as if uncertain how to proceed. "You hear me? Man, you don't hear anything. You don't know what it's like to be us. Real fans, real people who live and die by this team." Steph nodded, listening. He could see past the surface now. This wasn't about him. Not really. This was about something deeper, something personal. "Tell me," Steph encouraged, "what's got you feeling this way?" The man clenched his jaw, his hands balling into fists at his sides. Then, as if a dam had finally broken, the words came spilling out. "I've been a Warriors fan since before you were even born," he said, his voice thick with emotion. "Back when we were the joke of the league. Back when no one wore our colors, and we had to fight for respect. And now all these new people come in, bandwagoners, people who never suffered through the tough years. And you're the face of it all. You're their hero." Steph held his gaze, letting the words sink in. He could understand it now. The pain of someone who had been there through the darkest times, who had felt every loss, every letdown, and who now felt like his loyalty had been diluted by a wave of newcomers who hadn't endured the same journey. "I get it," Steph said quietly. "I really do." He leaned back in his chair, his eyes filled with understanding. "You loved this team when no one else did, and now with all the success, it must feel like something's been taken away from you. Like the identity of being a true Warriors fan isn't what it used to be." The man looked at him, his anger still present but wavering. No one had ever put it into words like that before. Steph continued, "But I want you to know something. Every time I step on that court, I don't play for the cameras. I don't play for the bandwagon fans. I play for you, the ones who were here before it all. The ones who felt every loss, every heartbreak. The ones who deserve every second of joy we're giving now." The cafe was still silent, but the tension had shifted. The man's breathing was heavier now, his face less hardened. His hands, which had been clenched into fists, slowly loosened. "I think about you guys every time I put on that jersey," Steph added. "I know what this means. I know how much this team is a part of people's lives, and I'll never take that for granted. The man exhaled sharply, looking down at his feet for a moment. When he looked back up, his eyes were glassy, his fury replaced with something else, something like reluctant respect. You. you really mean that? His voice was quieter now. Steph smiled, nodding. Every word. For a long moment, the man just stood there. Then, with a shaky breath, he gave a small, almost imperceptible nod. All right, he muttered. All right. The moment had passed, but its weight lingered in the air. Slowly, the cafe began to return to normal. The baristas exchanged looks, then got back to making drinks. Conversations restarted, though quieter than before. As the man turned to leave, Steph called after him. Hey, the man paused. Come to a game sometime. My treat, Steph offered. And bring some of those old school Warriors stories with you. For the time, the man cracked a small smile. It was barely there, but it was real. Maybe I will, he said before walking out the door. As soon as he left, the cafe seemed to exhale all at once. Someone let out a low whistle, while others exchanged glances, shaking their heads in quiet amazement. That, a barista murmured, was something else. Steph simply picked up his cappuccino again, giving a small smile. He hadn't needed to win an argument. He hadn't needed to prove anything. He had just needed to listen, and in doing so, he had changed everything. Steph sat back in his chair, feeling the weight of the moment still lingering in the air. He hadn't planned for any of this to happen when he walked into the cafe that afternoon. He had just wanted a quiet moment, a little escape from the world that constantly watched his every move. But life had a funny way of reminding him that there were no off days from being someone people looked up to. He took another sip of his cappuccino, letting the warmth settle in his chest as the conversations around him picked up again. A few people in the cafe were still glancing in his direction, some in admiration, others in thought. But the tension from earlier had dissipated, leaving behind a newfound energy, one of respect, understanding, and perhaps even a little wonder. A young woman sitting a few tables away caught his eye. She had been watching the entire exchange, her laptop open in front of her, fingers poised over the keyboard but unmoving. She looked hesitant, as if debating whether she should say something or let him be. Steph gave her a small, encouraging nod. That was incredible, she finally said, leaning forward slightly. I've never seen someone handle a situation like that before. Steph chuckled, rubbing the back of his neck. I don't know about incredible, he said modestly. I just listened. She shook her head. No, you did more than that. You didn't get defensive. You didn't brush him off. You met him where he was and you made him feel heard. That's rare. Steph nodded thoughtfully. Maybe. But I think people just want to be understood, you know? He wasn't mad at me, not really. He was mad at what he thought I represented. That's different. The woman sat back in her chair, considering his words. I wish more people thought like that, she admitted. The world would be a much better place. Steph smiled. It's not always easy, though. I think we're wired to react to confrontation with more confrontation. But sometimes the best way to diffuse a situation is just to be open. No one expects it. The woman laughed softly. Well, you definitely proved that today. A man at the counter who had also been quietly observing chimed in. I gotta admit, I was ready for that to go sideways. Thought for sure security would step in or you'd just get up and leave. Steph turned to face him. And that would have made sense, right? But then what? He would have left angrier, thinking I didn't care, and I would have left thinking I just avoided a problem instead of understanding it. The man nodded slowly, impressed. That's a hell of a perspective. Steph shrugged. I just try to put myself in other people's shoes. I've had my fair share of moments where I felt like I wasn't being heard. I know how frustrating that can be. The cafe had transformed in the past few minutes. What had once been a space filled with scattered conversations had now become a shared moment of reflection. The energy had shifted, and it was undeniable. People weren't just seeing Steph as a basketball player anymore. They were seeing the human beneath the jersey. Another customer, an older woman who had been quietly sipping her tea, spoke up. You know, she said, her voice gentle but firm. That man, he wasn't just speaking for himself. There are a lot of people who feel left behind in this city. It's not just about basketball, it's about change, and change is hard for people. Steph nodded, listening carefully. San Francisco isn't the same as it was 10, 20 years ago, she continued. People who have lived here their whole lives are struggling to recognize it. The team's success, the city's growth, it's all wonderful, but it also brings a sense of loss. The feeling that what once belonged to a few now belongs to everyone, and that can be hard to process. Steph exhaled, letting her words sink in. That makes a lot of sense, he admitted. Change is exciting, but it can also be painful. I guess I never thought about how our success as a team might feel like a shift in identity for the people who were there from the beginning. The woman smiled. You have a good heart, young man. You see things most people don't. Steph smiled back. I just try to stay open. There's always more to the story than what's on the surface. The conversation continued, flowing naturally as more people chimed in. The cafe had transformed into something more than just a coffee shop. It had become a space for connection, for understanding, and at the center of it all sat Steph, not as the famous athlete, but as a person who was willing to listen, willing to learn, and willing to meet people where they were. A few minutes later, as the buzz of the cafe returned to normal, the door swung open and a familiar figure stepped inside. It was the man from earlier. A hush fell over the room again, curiosity sparking in the air. Had he come back to say more? Was he still upset? Steph turned to face him, his expression open, welcoming. The man hesitated for a moment before taking a deep breath and walking towards Steph's table. He looked around at the people watching him before settling his gaze back on Steph. I just wanted to say, I was wrong about you, he said gruffly. Steph didn't respond immediately. He let the man speak at his own pace. I let my emotions get the best of me, the man admitted. I was carrying a lot and I took it out on you. That wasn't fair. Steph nodded, his expression understanding. It's all right, he said. We all have those moments. The man exhaled sharply, looking around the room before returning his gaze to Steph. You really meant what you said? About playing for the ones who were here from the start? Steph nodded without hesitation. Every word. The man studied him for a long moment before nodding back. Then, without another word, he reached into his pocket and pulled out something unexpected. An old, faded Warriors ticket stub. This was from 1995, the man said, holding it up. Back when we were bottom of the league. I held on to it all these years because no matter how bad we were, I always believed we'd have our moment. He placed the ticket stub on the table in front of Steph. I want you to have it, the man said. Steph's eyebrows lifted in surprise. Are you sure? The man nodded. Yeah, you've earned it. Steph picked up the ticket stub, running his fingers over its worn edges. It was more than just a piece of paper. It was history. It was loyalty. It was proof of belief before there was ever reason to believe. Thank you, Steph said sincerely. This means a lot. The man gave him a small, approving nod before turning to leave again. But this time, there was no tension in his posture, no anger in his step, just peace. As the door closed behind him, the cafe seemed to collectively exhale once more. Steph stared down at the ticket stub in his hands, a deep sense of gratitude washing over him. He had come here just looking for a cup of coffee, but he had walked away with something far greater: perspective, connection, and a reminder of why he played the game in the first place. He smiled to himself, tucking the ticket stub safely into his pocket before taking another sip of his now lukewarm cappuccino. It didn't matter, because in that moment he had never felt warmer. The coffee had long gone cold, but Steph Curry remained seated at the small wooden table, the weight of the old Warriors ticket stub still lingering in his hands. He turned it over slowly, tracing the worn edges with his thumb. The faded ink told a story of a time long before championship banners, before sold-out arenas filled with the echoes of fans wearing his jersey. It was a relic of loyalty, proof that the love for the game ran deeper than rings and trophies. A voice interrupted his thoughts. Man, you really are different. Steph looked up to see a young man standing near his table. He had been watching the entire exchange with wide eyes, his admiration clear. He wasn't alone. Several others in the cafe had remained transfixed by what had unfolded. I don't know about different, Steph said with a chuckle. Just human. The young man shook his head. Nah, I mean it. I've seen athletes walk away from moments like that, ignore them, maybe even react in anger. But you... He gestured toward the door where the older man had left. You made him feel heard. That's rare. Steph offered a humble smile, taking in the sincerity of the young man's words. Sometimes people just need to know they matter, he said simply. The young man nodded, his gaze thoughtful. I've always looked up to you on the court, man. But this is next level. Steph didn't quite know how to respond to that. He was used to praise for his three-pointers, his handles, his leadership on the court. But moments like these, they felt different. More important, in a way. The young man hesitated for a moment before speaking again. You mind if I sit? Steph gestured to the seat across from him. Of course. As the young man pulled out the chair, Steph noticed the Warriors logo on his jacket. One of the newer ones, the kind that had become popular after the team's rise to dominance. You a longtime fan? Steph asked. The young man smiled almost sheepishly. Not like that guy, he admitted, nodding toward the door. I mean, I watched basketball growing up, but I wasn't deep into it until you guys started winning. Steph nodded, appreciating the honesty. But I love this team, the young man continued, his voice carrying an earnestness. And I love what you stand for. Not just the championships, but the way you lead. You're more than a player. You make people believe in something bigger. Steph leaned back slightly, considering the words. Belief is powerful, he said after a moment. It's what keeps people going, even when things aren't easy. The young man exhaled, nodding. Yeah, I could use some of that right now. Steph noticed the slight shift in his tone. Something on your mind? He asked. The young man hesitated, as if unsure whether to open up. But there was something about Steph's presence, his openness, that made it easy to speak. Yeah, he finally admitted. It's been a rough year. I lost my dad a few months ago. He was the one who really got me into basketball. We didn't have much, but we'd always watch games together. It was our thing. Steph's expression softened. I'm really sorry to hear that. The young man nodded, looking down at his hands. After he passed, I kinda lost myself for a while. Stopped watching games. Stopped caring about anything, really. It just felt empty. Steph stayed quiet, giving him space to continue. But then, one night, I caught one of your games by accident. I was flipping through channels and saw you hit this insane three-pointer. And for the first time in months, I felt something again. I remembered what it felt like to be excited, to believe in something. Steph's chest tightened at the sincerity in the young man's voice. So I started watching again, he continued. Not just the games, but interviews, clips of you talking about hard work, faith, perseverance, and it helped. It really did. Because if you could keep pushing, keep believing, then maybe I could too. Steph took a deep breath, absorbing the weight of the moment. It was one thing to impact a game, it was another to impact a life. Man, Steph said, shaking his head slightly, I can't tell you how much that means to me. The young man gave a small smile. It means a lot to me too. Steph nodded, thoughtful. Your dad, he'd be proud of you. The young man looked down, his eyes glistening. I hope so. Steph reached across the table, tapping the old ticket stub still resting there. You see this? He said. This is proof that love for this game, it lasts. It runs deep. And the love you and your dad shared, that doesn't go away. It stays with you. The young man exhaled, a quiet but significant nod of understanding. Basketball's more than just a sport, Steph continued. It connects people, families, generations. And just because your dad's not physically here doesn't mean he's not still a part of that. The young man smiled, the weight on his shoulders seeming just a little lighter. Thanks, man. That means a lot. Steph smiled back. Any time. As the conversation settled, the cafe returned to its usual hum. But the energy had shifted again. There was a sense of connection that hadn't been there before. A shared understanding among strangers who had, for a brief moment, become something more. The barista, who had been quietly watching from behind the counter, finally spoke up. You know, she said, this might be the first time a cafe has turned into a therapy session because of an NBA player. Laughter rippled through the room. Even Steph chuckled. Hey, coffee and conversation. Perfect combination. Another customer grinned. You ever thought about hosting a talk show, Steph? Coffee with Curry has a nice ring to it. Steph laughed. I'll stick to basketball for now. The atmosphere in the cafe had completely transformed. People weren't just sitting at their tables anymore. They were engaging, sharing stories, reflecting on the moments that mattered. It was a ripple effect, started by one man's outburst and Steph's willingness to meet it with understanding instead of defensiveness. As Steph finally stood to leave, the young man across from him did the same. "Can I get a picture before you go?" he asked. Steph smiled. "Of course." They took a quick photo, and as the young man checked it on his phone, he looked up with an appreciative grin. "This is gonna mean a lot." Steph clapped him on the shoulder. "Keep pushing forward, man. And remember, your dad's still with you." The young man nodded, his eyes shining with gratitude. Steph turned toward the door, but before he could step out, the barista called after him. "Wait!" He turned, amused. "Yeah?" She held up a fresh cappuccino. "On the house?" she said with a smile. "For the best conversation we've ever had in here." Steph grinned, accepting the cup. "Appreciate it." As he finally stepped outside, the cool San Francisco air hit his face. He glanced down at the old Warriors ticket stub still tucked in his hand, turning it over once more. There were moments in life that reminded him why he played this game. Not for the accolades, not for the fame, but for the connections. The moments that reached beyond the hardwood, the moments where he could be more than just a basketball player. He slid the ticket stub into his pocket, took a sip of his coffee, and walked down the street, a quiet smile on his face. Because today, he had won something far greater than a game. He had won hearts. As Steph walked down the sidewalk, the city humming around him, he reflected on how an ordinary moment in a cafe had transformed into something meaningful. He had walked in seeking solitude, a simple coffee break from the demands of his career, yet he was walking out having made a deeper connection with people he had never met before. The wind carried the scent of roasted beans and fresh pastries down the street as he sipped his complimentary cappuccino. He smiled to himself. Small moments of kindness, whether giving or receiving, had a way of making the world feel a little lighter. His steps were unhurried, his mind still replaying the conversations in the cafe. The older man's frustration, his pain masked as anger, the young fan's grief, his journey toward healing, and the countless others who had sat in quiet observation, maybe even internal reflection. He had come in expecting to blend into the background, yet somehow he had become part of their stories. And that was the beauty of life, wasn't it? The unexpected moments, the connections that formed in places you never anticipated. As he reached the corner of the street, he heard a voice call out, "Steph!" He turned to see a group of kids playing basketball on a half-worn court tucked between two buildings. The hoop was slightly bent, the pavement cracked, but the energy was undeniable. A boy no older than 10 bounced the ball toward him with wide eyes. "You gotta take a shot," Steph grinned, setting his coffee on a nearby bench. "You sure about that?" The kids erupted in laughter, nodding eagerly. One of them handed him the ball, a slightly deflated, well-loved Spalding that had seen better days. Steph held it for a moment, feeling its rough texture beneath his fingertips. He stepped back to the three-point line, not quite regulation, but close enough, spun the ball once in his hands, then released it with the smooth flick of his wrist. The ball sailed through the air, spinning in perfect rhythm, and sank through the net with a clean swish. The kids exploded in cheers, jumping and shouting, their excitement infectious. "Steph Curry, baby!" one of them yelled, running circles around the court. Steph laughed, shaking his head. "All right, who's got next?" They tossed him the ball again, and for the next 20 minutes he played pickup with them, calling out plays, teaching them ball handling tricks, encouraging their shots. For a few moments there were no cameras, no media, no pressures of being an NBA superstar, just a group of kids and a man who loved the game as much as they did. When he finally stepped off the court, breathless but grinning, one of the kids ran up and tugged at his sleeve. "You gonna come back?" Steph crouched down, ruffling the boy's hair. "You keep working on that jumper and I just might have to..." The boy beamed. As Steph picked up his coffee and walked away, he glanced once more at the old Warriors ticket stub in his pocket. Moments like these, the small, unexpected ones, were the ones that truly mattered. Steph strolled away from the court, his heart lighter than when he had first entered the cafe earlier that afternoon. The city of San Francisco buzzed around him, cars honking in the distance, pedestrians lost in their own worlds, but he felt connected in a way that was rare. The streets had a pulse, a rhythm he had come to love over the years. He had arrived in the Bay Area as a young, hopeful player, drafted by a team that was struggling to find its identity. Now, years later, he walked these streets as a champion, a leader, a symbol of a city that had transformed alongside its team. But today had reminded him of something deeper. The game wasn't just about winning titles. It was about people, their struggles, their joys, their memories tied to every dribble, every shot, every comeback victory. As he made his way toward his car, parked a few blocks away, he noticed a small bookstore tucked between two larger buildings. It was one of those hidden gems, the kind of place where the scent of old paper and ink greeted you at the door. Steph had always loved bookstores, not just for the books, but for the quiet, reflective energy they carried. On a whim, he decided to step inside. The bell above the door jingled as he entered, and an elderly man behind the counter looked up with a smile. "Welcome in," the man said, adjusting his reading glasses. Steph nodded in return, taking in the shelves stacked high with books of every genre. He walked slowly through the aisles, running his fingers along the spines, enjoying the calm after the storm of emotions from earlier. His eyes landed on a book titled The Heart of a Champion. It was old, the edges frayed, the pages slightly yellowed. Something about it called to him, so he pulled it off the shelf and flipped it open. The words on the first page caught his attention immediately. A true champion is not measured by their victories alone, but by their ability to inspire others to believe in themselves. Steph smiled to himself. If today had taught him anything, it was that greatness wasn't just about stats and accolades. It was about impact, about the way people walked away from an interaction feeling different than when they had arrived. He closed the book and walked to the counter. "I'll take this one," he said. The bookstore owner rang him up, his eyes twinkling with curiosity. "You look familiar," he said as he placed the book in a paper bag. Steph chuckled. "I get that a lot." The old man studied him for a moment, then smiled knowingly. "Well, whoever you are, you've got good taste in books." Steph laughed, taking the bag. "I appreciate that." As he stepped outside, he tucked the book under his arm, glancing up at the sky. The sun was starting to dip lower, casting a golden glow over the city. He thought back to the older man in the cafe, the young fan who had lost his father, the kids on the basketball court. Every single one of them had reminded him why he played, why he dedicated himself to the game, why he carried the responsibility of being a role model. It wasn't just about being a great player. It was about being a person worth looking up to. As he reached his car, his phone buzzed in his pocket. He pulled it out and saw a message from his wife, Aisha. "Aisha, hey babe, where you at? The kids are asking for you." Steph smiled, his heart swelling at the thought of his family. "Steph, on my way. Got caught up in some good conversations. Aisha. Sounds like you." He chuckled, shaking his head. She knew him too well. He slid into the driver's seat and started the car, but before pulling away, he reached into his pocket and pulled out the old Warriors ticket stub again. He held it in his hands for a moment, then carefully tucked it into the book he had just bought, pressing it between the pages as if storing a piece of history. As he drove home, he thought about the generations of fans who had loved this team before him, who had endured the heartbreaks and celebrated the triumphs. He thought about the people who had found meaning in basketball beyond just the game itself, who had found connection, hope, even healing. And he realized something. Basketball wasn't just about moments on the court. It was about moments like these, the ones that didn't make headlines but changed lives in ways that couldn't always be measured. He had won championships, broken records, and revolutionized the game. But today, in a simple cafe, on a cracked neighborhood court, and in a quiet bookstore, he had done something just as important. He had listened. He had connected. And in doing so, he had reminded people, and himself, what the heart of a champion truly was. As Steph pulled into his driveway, the warm glow of his home's lights welcomed him. He could already hear the faint laughter of his kids through the windows, the sound wrapping around him like a familiar embrace. After everything that had happened today, the unexpected encounter at the cafe, the conversation with the young fan, the impromptu game with the kids at the court, this was where he belonged. He stepped inside, and before he could even take off his shoes, his daughter Riley ran up to him, her eyes full of excitement. "Daddy, you're home!" she squealed, throwing her arms around his waist. Steph lifted her effortlessly, kissing the top of her head. "I'm home, baby girl." Aisha walked in from the kitchen, a knowing smile on her face. You had one of those days again, didn't you? Steph chuckled, setting Riley down. Yeah, but the good kind. Aisha stepped closer, resting a hand on his chest. That's why people love you, she said softly. Because you don't just play the game. You change people's lives. Steph exhaled, feeling the truth in her words. I just try to be present, he said. Sometimes that's all people need. If you liked this video, please give it a like and subscribe to our channel. Also, leave your comments below and tell us. What are your thoughts on a stranger yelling at Steph Curry in a cafe? We want to hear from you. Thank you for watching and see you next time.